Okay, a couple announcements. On Monday, George is going to set up a total station with you out in the field at the beginning of the day and show you how the PySnap works and how that's configured. I think they're going to shoot drone photos on Monday, so you probably were told to come at 7:30 or something. If you haven't, you probably will be told to come at 7:30. So it'll be about 7:38 sometime. We'll set that up. I just want to do a quick review of yesterday and the georeferencing idea. We talked about how the whole point when you're dealing with images is that the images themselves have their own coordinate space. And if you open up an image, let's open this up with Preview instead of Adobe here. So if you open up an image in some kind of program, there'll be some way that you can go in and see what the dimensions are of the image. iDig has a 2048 pixel limit at the moment, so if you try to import a plan that's bigger than that, it will yell at you. So you just resize it down to 2048 as a maximum dimension. And then once you have your image, the whole point is to try to find some way to go between the image pixel space and some other coordinate system. So we looked at this affine function where it takes one x and y value. Say if it's coming from the total station, this might be something like 400 meters over, 300 meters up. It multiplies that by these 6 magic numbers, which we saw to get the point in the new coordinate system. So this is how, when you take a total station point, comes in as meters, iDig transforms it, gets the dimensions in pixels, goes over on the image that many pixels, down that many pixels, and then draws a little triangle there and puts a 33 in it. And likewise, you can take these 6 numbers and do an invert on them to go the other way. So you can take a point in pixels, multiply it by your numbers, and you get your point in meters. And this is how iDig is able to say, if you make something new, find, go in and add a point somewhere. It's taking the pixels that I touch and transforming them back into meters. So that's the back and forth on the plans that go into iDig. There's 3 different ways we looked at to telling iDig these 6 numbers. The first way is just to include the lower left-hand and upper right-hand points in the actual file name, and iDig will use those control points to generate the numbers. The second way is to create the control points inside iDig manually, and then it can georeference that and get those numbers. And the last way was if you have a world file to include that with the image itself, and then iDig will import that. So yesterday we had an interesting situation where we put into the plans folder in the iDig folder these three documents. One is a plan with the point in the file name, and then there's a TIFF file with the world file. And if you go back to iDig then, and you say, okay, let's get out of here and make a new trench. Let's call it A. And then if I import the plans, it's going to pull the plans in from that folder. And the one that had the control points in the file name, if we go into this and add a point, let's say up here where we expect it to be about 435, 360, you'll see that it automatically transforms that point into meters, no problem. The other one, when you pull it in, if you try to add a point to it or something like that, let's go back and select it first. So you can have the plan selected, go inside, add a point. It's going to give you this georeferencing instructions if it can't find a world file for that. So the problem we had yesterday is that the world file, if we look at it, if I take it and I drag it out and look at it, I think I probably have to take this out of full screen to do that. If I take this world file, which we expect to define the parameters, I open it up in a text editor and I look at it, you'll notice that basically what happened is yesterday I wrote these other numbers in there, the N1, N2, N3. And so iDig was like, I don't know what this file is with all these N numbers in there. So let's fix that. Let's drag that back and replace the one that's in there. Now I can delete all the other plans I have, the beta theta 2016, there's the TIFF, there's the world file. Let's delete those. And then we can go back to iDig. Let's get rid of this plan. Trash it again, try again, import the plans. Now, theoretically, it should have read that total station file, and now, the world file, and now it's giving us the actual points in the meters. So there is no current alert if you import a bad world file. We'll probably add one based on this experience. But that's one thing you might want to check when you're doing the plans. There was another question about these fields at the top of the point editor here. If I create some kind of bounding box, let's go and see if I can go in, edit these points. Let's make a bounding box here. Now these points, since they're touch points, they don't have any levels. There's a name field up here that allows you to name the polygon. So you can name this open, close, something like that. And iDig will use this information to determine which polygon is your open and close. There's the date that the points were taken. There's an agrog grid reference there that converts it to the agrog grid because that's written into the notebook still. If you look at something that has total station points, such as like beta theta west here, we go in and look at this polygon. What you'll notice is that the levels line is showing you the highest elevation and the lowest elevation. You can toggle this line and it will go through various things. Here's the X dimension from 403 to 406, the Y range, the average point, and the area that polygon takes up. So there's a little bit of extra information there. Most of that's just used when they're writing in the notebooks and they have to fill in this old information, such as grids and elevations and things like that. So that's the points and the plans. So now let's look at the preference files. Let's start looking at these in more detail. So the first thing we did was we talked about how there's one general preference file for everything. If this file doesn't exist, iDig will make it when it starts up. So there's always one preference file in there that defaults to being the agraz configuration. You can also create JSON file configurations for other trenches, and as long as it has the same name as the trench, when you go to that trench in iDig, it's going to pull in those specific preferences for that trench. So here at Poros, they're using dies, artifacts, events, images, and plans. In other excavations, we use other different types. So, yes, question?
Okay, because he said if there's no preferences file, for example, in an iPad, you only download iDig, you don't download JSON. So
Right.
it will work?
It'll work with the default preferences folder, which is set up for the Agora.
Okay.
If you want to configure another excavation, you need to get that file off of there, edit it in some kind of text editor or a JSON editor that'll check it for you, and then once you're done, you put it back and replace it, and that'll set your new preferences. Either if you have a preferences.json file, it'll do it for every new trench you create. If there's a trench-specific preference file, then it will use that instead. So it's kind of a fallback. So if we look at this preference file, we started looking at it a bit yesterday. I hope you all had a little bit of JSON reading last night. There were the two views, the raw text view, this is the raw file, and then the computer parsed version of that. We talked about how the whole preference file is basically one single object. It starts with a curly brace, and then everything inside of it is a key and a value. And so if we collapse all these values, we can see the general format of it is it's got the comment section at the top, which is just an array of strings with instructions for the preference file. It doesn't have to be there. The version should probably always be 2. There was an earlier preference file version 1, which was a different format. So that should always probably be 2. There's a project key, and then this is set to Agora. This will determine, sometimes we have to put very specific behavior in iDig for different excavations. In the past, it's been easier just to use that to say if you're at Keros, then do this or do that. So we've done that a few times where people do very strange things. The max digits, let's have a quick look at that. Basically what the max digits defines is related to the points, and it says it's a decimal number, and basically you read this as I want 4 significant digits on the left of the decimal place and 3 on the right. So if we go to somewhere like Poros, let's go to Poros here, and we edit the max dimensions. Their dimensions are in longitude and latitude coordinates, and so they have a lot more decimal places. So right now it's set on 2.6, so two digits on the left and 6 on the right. So if I go to the Poros trench, I look at one of these dives, say AN19, I go to the points. You can see that all these points basically have 2 digits on the left of the decimal place and then 6 on the right. Sometimes you deal with coordinate systems like eggs and things like that where it'll be in meters and your first number might be something like, 5, 1, 2, 3, 6, 4. You might have 10 digits is before the decimal place. Where when you're on the excavation, you're only concerned, say, with the last few that actually represent the meters in the area you're digging. So the max digits allows me to go in and say, well, for this excavation, let's say we only want 2 digits after the decimal place, and we only want 1 digit to show before the decimal place. Now if I save this, go back to iDig, switch trenches to force it to load the new preferences, go back into that dive, A19 here. You'll see that you're basically only seeing 1 decimal place on the left and maximum 2 on the right. If you go in and you try to edit these, you'll see the 23.5 on the left. It's not going to chop that on the left. It's only going to be the display value. But on the right here, you're only getting basically 1 decimal place on that one. You get 2 on here because it's 5.1. So that max digits is another way you can control, say, how many digits are actually shown to the user. So if I go back into Poros, let's change this back to 2 point, and I want 6 decimal places after. Now when I go back to Poros, switch trenches to get it to load those new prefs. Let's go back to that dive and look at the points. And now all my points are showing me 2 digits on the left and 6 on the right. So that allows you to kind of adjust how the points are displayed to the user based on which digits are actually significant in the points you're using. Like I said, some grids will have huge numbers in front, or maybe they only need 2 afterwards or 3 afterwards if you're going down to the millimeter level. But that's how you control that with the max digits.
But that's only the digits that are shown in the iPad.
That's only the digits that are shown in the iPad. Yeah.
The total station counts much more.
The sorry?
The total station counts.
Yeah, the total station points will come in as they are. This is just what you display to the user essentially to use. So the other things inside here is there's a WGS84 control point section. We talked about that. This is just a bunch of hard-coded control points that are mapping from the Agaraz grid to WGS84 longitude and latitude coordinates. If this section is in here, then when you export your trench data, and I go into, let's say, numbers here, iDig, let's go to one of these exported ones like Beta Theta West exported here. Let's look at the baskets. So if I look at the baskets, what you'll have is all these various fields across the top that iDig's exporting: date earliest, date latest, description, baskets, cleaning, so on and so forth. I think I have to go down to basket 1 here, which actually has points. And then what you'll notice is that on each of these, you'll get 2 different types. So this is coverage envelope XYZ and coverage envelope Geo, these 2 fields. So if I look at these, what you'll notice is that the envelope is basically just the bounding box around all the points you took. And here the envelope is in meters on the Agorod grid. And the second one, the Geo one, it's transformed those points for you into WGS84. And that's convenient so that if you're working with the GIS system, you can just import that field, the Geo field, in instead of the other one if you're working in the WGS84 coordinate system. So that's the WGS84 control point section. Then there's a field section and a type section. The field section is optional, and we'll look at that later, but that's basically just kind of like default definitions of fields. This is useful if you have a field that's used across types, such as, let's look for one here. Let's go down. So there's the WGS84 section. Here's the field section. So if I look at the category field, for example, there at the top, what you'll notice is that we're in the field section. These are default values for the field category. So if I use the field category in a basket, in a find, in any other one of the types, it'll read these definitions here. And this definition basically says, for the labels, if it's in Greek, then use kategoria. If it's in English, use the word category. And so these labels that are in here allow you to define multiple different languages. If you look at something like the Swiss preferences, these guys, with all their fields, they have, here's a bunch of labels for this group. They have a French label, they have an Italian label, a German label, and an English label, and the Greek label's not filled in. So this will allow them to switch their trench between these different languages, switch their whole iPad actually between these different languages to see different results. So let's try that one. So let me say I go to iDig. I'm looking at, let's go to Beta Theta West 2013. So I'm looking at all these things in English here. So each one of these types has a label, and that label is showing up in English. If I go and I change my iPad, I go to the settings, general language and region. I want the iPad language to be Greek. Elenica, continue. That's going to switch my entire iPad to Greek. So all the menus and all the settings, everything is going to be in Greek after this comes back. It takes a little bit of time. Once it comes back, I have to there it comes. Okay, so now everything is in Greek for your iPad. And likewise, when you go to iDig and you load up these things, what it's going to do is it's going to pull in all the different labels from that language. So with the labels, you can control what those things look like inside iDig based on the language that the iPad's set on. So that's how the Swiss manage with their multi-language teams. Let me change this back to English.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
What happens if we change the name of the type?
Okay, that's a good question. I'll show you that. Basically, what I'm going to go through now is we're going to look at the types that iDig has, and there's a kind of a distinction to be made between the, say, the internal types that iDig uses versus what kind of types exist on the excavation that you map it into. So, what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the types section in the preference file here. So let's close all these up. So the type section is basically going to have one object per type that defines that type and all of its fields and things like that. The first one here is a context. So the type is set for context. It has a bunch of labels for how to display that type based on the languages, and then some other things here. We can go in and look at it through the text view as well. If I go down to baskets here. So here's the context type. So the types, the whole section is just an array, a list, and each thing in the list is one object, and so this is one type. So this type is defined as a context. It has labels defined for it, saying it's a basket, and when it's plural, you want baskets. It has a relationship section here, which is defining if you're inside a basket and I hit the plus button, what are the different types of things I can add to this type? And in this case, if it's a basket, I can add another context, another one of these same types. And the relation here is set for is above. So this is going to default, if I add another context to the one I'm looking at, it's going to make a new one, and it's going to say the previous one is above the one I just made. So this is a way that, again, you can make a very convenient way to add new things to a type. So if I add an artifact to a basket, it's going to set automatically the include relationship. It's going to say this artifact is inside this basket. You can always change these relationships manually. This is just giving you the default one for speed in terms of what it makes. So it has a relationship section, and then it goes into a group section where it starts defining the fields. So let's start with the types, and let's look at all the different iDig types here. So let's go down and make some space here. Okay. Can I get up here or not? Okay, let's start with the easiest ones and go to the harder ones. So let's start with plan. So the plan type, as we've seen in iDig, this has certain kind of behavior. If I'm on a basket, for example, and I click on the basket, it's going to show me where that basket is on the right. Okay? But if I click on a plan, it doesn't make sense for the plan to do that. So if I click on a plan, it's actually going to change the background plan. Sorry, I'm not showing you this. So let's try that again. So if I'm looking at a basket and I click on one of these, it's going to show me where the basket is on the right. If I click on one of these plans, it's just going to change the base plan for me. So each one of these types that is, say, internal to iDig has certain behavior associated with it. Another type that's very common, so every trench will basically have a plan type, because otherwise you won't have a background plan to work with. So every excavation, every trench you deal with will most likely have a plan type. Another common one is image. The image type is any photograph you take will automatically be tagged as an image type. And the iDig knows how to handle the images in that particular way based on what it is. So the other types, the other most common ones, say, are the untyped type, and this is the default type everything gets when you make a new item. So if I go to iDig and I say I want to make a new item, it's going to start off as untyped, which means basically you haven't told me what you want me to be. And so it'll stay that way until you set it. Now, this is different from, say, the other type. If I type it as an other type, that means, okay, I want you in my trench for some reason. I took some random point over there and I want to keep it for the season. I took some dimensions for some other thing. This is kind of like a junk drawer type. It's like saying, I want this information around, but I'm not really going to use it for anything else. So untyped and other are two easy ones that will usually exist in every single trench. There's a section type and then artifact type. So the section type is mainly used for cross-section lines, and these have certain kind of behavior associated with them as well. They're always drawn, if I go back and see my cross-sections here, they're always drawn as a line. They're not drawn filled in like a basket is. And I can double tap these things and it will restore the cross section that it's over. And I can also look inside the cross section type, and the cross section type will maintain its own set of relationships for all the different things that are underneath it. It'll do that automatically. So the cross section type has certain types of behavior, say in iDig. If we look at the artifact type, which is used for tracking individual objects, like in this case, we're tracking finds with them. If we look at something like, let's look at baskets. Take basket 1 here, and let's just filter everything just down to basket 1. Okay, so we're just looking at basket 1 now, okay? If I go into basket 1 and I change its type, so basket 1 has these 2 polygons associated with it, the opening polygon and the closing polygon. If I change the basket type to, say, an artifact, in this case it's a find, you'll notice that it no longer displays as a full polygon. It's just displaying as a dot. Even though those polygons are still there, it's just showing you the center point, because that's how it displays artifacts. If I change this to a cross-section type, it's just going to display the outline. It doesn't actually display the inside in this case. So this basket goes all the way around, so you're basically just seeing like a cross-section line, and so on and so forth. Feature is going to show it completely. If it's a photo, there's an arrow that shows up and also just a dot, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that iDig's internal types all have certain behavior. So it's not necessarily like this context type, which we map baskets to here. This context type doesn't always necessarily have to be like what you would refer to as a context in real life. It's going to act a certain way in iDig. So when you map types from an excavation to iDig, you don't want to think like what's the name that matches closely. You want to think what's the behavior that matches the closest to the type I'm dealing with in the real world. So some of the other types, the artifact type is an interesting one, because this was the point where at the beginning we were just adding new types for different things, but then we realized, well, you know, they basically all have the same kind of behavior. Like in the Agora, you might track finds and you might track coins separately because they're more important. So what we did is we added the ability to make a subtype. So sometimes what you'll see in the preference files is these primary types. So you'll have something like type artifact, and then you'll have subtype find or something like that. Or you might have type artifact, subtype coin. And so they're both the same iDig type, but you've created 2 separate kind of subtypes, and each one of those subtypes can have its own fields. So this will allow you to say only have certain fields for finds, certain fields for coins. Maybe you want to track bones separately. So you'd make a subtype of artifact that's bones, and you'd have certain fields for that. So this is the primary way to expand iDig to handle new types of data on excavations is basically you want to subtype one of the iDig types to get the behavior that you want. So other types that we have are group and partition. These two types, the group type is used for lots, say in the Agora. And what they'll do is when they dig, they'll dig with baskets and they'll say, okay, well, you know, we've dug this basket. There might be a new layer coming out here. Let's switch baskets and start a new basket because I'm not sure exactly if we got new stuff or not. And that'll keep all the, say, the pottery, the finds, everything associated with these separate baskets. But then at the end of the year, they go through and they lot, which means they look at all the pottery and all the baskets and they say, oh, well, these two baskets were on top of each other, but there's like one pot and half its sherds are in this one and half are in this one, so it's probably all the same thing. And then they'll lot those two baskets together for storage reasons and say these are basically the same thing. So that when they dig, they'll dig conservatively with context and baskets and things to keep things separately. And then usually at the end of the season, there'll be a pass-through where they'll collapse items. And that's what the group type is for, things that get collapsed from other types. Because the group with the lot, what you can do is they'll say, I want to make a new lot, I want to add these two baskets to it, now I want to auto-fill that lot, and it'll go and suck in all the context from both of the baskets that you included in that lot automatically. So there is some features with group types that handle adding a bunch of different types to it as a group, and then it somehow makes your life easier by automatically filling in fields for you. The partition type is used to, if you have like a basket and you're digging it and you're like, oh, I want to actually treat this thing I found inside this basket separately. So at Keros, they use these ASU types that allow them to kind of subdivide a basket into smaller areas. So you can either combine multiple things together into one group, or you can take one thing and kind of subdivide it into different partitions. So those two are used for that. There is the context type and the feature type. These are a little bit different. The context type is basically the dirt. So every excavation is going to be dealing with some kind of type of thing, which is where they track their dirt they dig. So it's going to be a basket, a loci, a context, whatever word they use for it. You can just title it whatever you want with a label. But internally, iDig sees this as dirt. It usually has a top polygon. It usually has a bottom polygon. It should be included in cross sections and things like that. The feature type is similar, but usually with features, they're things that are in your trench that do not get taken out, like a wall or like something you're going to leave there. And so the feature type usually has a top polygon defining its area, but you don't know the bottom. So if you don't know the bottom of it, because you don't know how deep that wall goes or how deep anything really goes. So what happens with iDig is if I draw like a cross section across a bunch of features and contexts, the features themselves are all going to have a fixed bottom point that agrees kind of with what you're looking at. So iDig is smart enough to know that if I'm dealing with features, I don't really know the bottom of it, so it's just going to arbitrarily create a bottom point for you. So those are the main differences.
Negative feature like a well or a pit.
You could, if you have a feature like a well and you want it, and if you don't define a bottom for it, it's just going to arbitrarily make a bottom that equals the other stuff you're looking at. If you go down into that well and you take a measurement at the bottom and put that in, now it knows, so now it can draw that whole thing. If I put an actual lower elevation inside those things. So yeah, it's smart enough to do that. The other types of things that iDig has inside is there is a sample type. These are some of the ones we added afterwards. This is if people are trying to track, they want to have a context and they want to take a soil sample to go and do a flotation on it or some other kind of analysis on it. They'll track their sample type separately. There's an interface type, which is used mainly for, people will use this to, if they want to track cuts. Some excavations they'll have a pit and they'll dig the soil out, and that's one thing, but the actual cutting of that pit is another event that they want to track. So they want to track that separately, like in a Harris matrix. So the interface allows you to define things that are kind of between other two types.
Would you deal with like a distinct stratigraphic layer?
Some excavations are using the interface type to define their surfaces. So if they're just digging layers and they find a special surface they want to mark, they'll track that separately as an interface type as well. So that's in there to be used. There is then the last two that we added when we did Poros was the survey type, and this is kind of like a cross section where it's always displayed as a line. It's assumed to be some kind of track that you go along. And then there's the event type, which we added, where these are specific kind of either modern or usually modern kind of events that happen related to your workflow. Like in Poros, they were using it to say, we need to make sure we measure, photograph, and every single object we find. So on one dive, someone might say, well, I was able to photograph it. Okay, so then they mark that as photographed. Then they know, okay, well, we need to go and measure this find as well. So then they send someone else down to do a measurement. So depending on your workflow, some people will track events more precisely than other people will in terms of their thing. So these are the main iDig types, the ones that exist. And so if you go to the preference file and you look at these types here, you'll notice that every single one of these, starting with the first one, it'll define the type as one of these iDig types. If you put another kind of type in there that iDig doesn't recognize, iDig will say, I don't know what this type is. So you always need to map something from the outside world into an iDig type. Then you can use labels and things like that to make it appear however you want it to be called inside. Yeah.
If we have a type and we name it completely different than what you told
One of those iDig types? Yeah, iDig will just say, I don't recognize that
No?
type. Yeah,
Okay.
it'll come in as untyped because I don't recognize it.
If we put another type from the ones that already exist in iDig, will iDig have a problem to understand that? For example,
If you have multiple ones, I think it just picks the first one, and if it hits the second one, if you have two definitions of context, say in there, and they're not subtyped. If they're subtyped, then it's fine. It's like, okay, well, this is type context subtype basket. This is type context subtype surface or something. If you have that, that's fine. But if you have two definitions of one type, iDig will just ignore the second one, is what happens.
And one can add as many types and subtypes as they want.
Exactly. You can. You can expand this as far out as you want to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if an excavation you have to make a completely new type. That isn't
If there's a completely new type, let's say like we want to start recording in 3D dimensions or something. We want to record photogrammetry. Something like that would probably cause us to create a new iDig type for that. Because again, you're not mapping like I call my things loci and you don't have a loci type. No, you're mapping behavior. You want this to function as like a context does. So you'll map it to the functionality, the behavior that iDig gives it, not necessarily just the name. The name you can change however you want with the labels and make it appear exactly like they want it to appear. But the actual behavior is going to be defined by the iDig type. Whether it draws it as, and it's all over the app. If you go into iDig and you look at things like let's say you look at the graph of this, the lots are going to have circles, baskets are going to have squares as their type. If you have finds in here, they're going to appear as diamonds and things like that. So there's all this kind of built-in behavior based on these various types that you'll see. The color, each type has its own kind of color defined when you show by type and things like that. So again, you're mapping behavior you're not necessarily mapping the semantics in the words.
Did you build this?
What?
Did you build this up?
Yeah.
Ah.
This is what I did for a few years. Okay.
Yes,
Let's look. Let's look at the. Let's start looking at the fields. So if you look at the preference file at the top, there's some explanation of this, and it talks about Dublin Core. Dublin Core. So one of the main reasons why we released iDig to the public and made it configurable for other excavations is because up till now, most excavations are kind of using their own recording systems, and there's not much compatibility between their data. And so with iDig, we're exporting, say, the spatial fields, the point data in a very it's using well-known text. It's a very simple text format that can be imported into anything else. The time data, the chronology, and these kind of fields. So what the hope is that even if people use iDig now and they don't publish their data, eventually when that data becomes public, it will be compatible with itself. So I can pull up a Google map of Greece and say, show me every excavation that uses iDig, and it will just work. The data will be compatible with those kind of interfaces. So the idea is to try to find some space, some kind of like field names that you can use that can be universal in a way. And so what we decided on is to just use Dublin Core. And Dublin Core is this metadata standard that was designed in Dublin, Ohio by, say, academics, librarians, people like that. It's very confusing, and if you go to their site and you try to understand it, you can get lost pretty easily. If you go to the Wikipedia page on this and scroll down, you'll see that essentially at its core, what Dublin Core are these 15 field names. So this is the essence of it. The librarians sitting around going, we all have to have a description, we all have to have a title, we all have to have a creator field, a contributor, a coverage. So they sat down and decided these are the 15 field names that everyone should have so that our data is somewhat compatible across institutions. So iDig is using this Dublin Core field name system as the primary fields that it will export. So when iDig exports a field, it'll use these same Dublin Core field names or prefixes. So for example, you can see here that the 15 Dublin Core field names, these are iDig's field names and prefixes, and you should never use them for your custom fields. You should use some other kind of name, not these, because these are ones that iDig is going to automatically make. So if you look in the next section, you can see that there are certain fields that iDig is going to automatically generate for you, such as the coverage XYZ field. That's going to be the 3D XYZ data of the item. Coverage geo field, it'll generate that if you have the control points. A coverage UTC field, which will have your date in the UTC format, the standard format for dates and times. And so on and so forth. The relationships as well, they get exported with these UUID fields. The identifier UUID, that's the big UUID number that's going to uniquely identify this item. So there's a lot of fields that iDig will export, but they'll all start with one of those Dublin Core field names. So those are the fields that iDig uses. The other fields, you can define whatever ones you want. So if we go through here a little bit, let's look and see how this works. So we've got the max digits. Let's go to context. Let's start with context. Here's types, context. All right, so we have the labels section, which is defining the labels for that type. We have the relationship section, which is defining what relationships you can add to this type. And then it starts with the group section. Okay, so the group section is essentially, if I go into iDig and I go to one of these types like a basket, you'll notice that out in the main list, If I click on the section headers, I can collapse and expand these various lists of things. And likewise, when I'm inside of one of these items, I can also expand and contract these group sections. So as I look here and I contract, say, those sections, what I'm essentially looking at now are the groups that are defined in this preference file. So the first groups, okay, the fields in this group, it starts with source, type, identifier, title, date earliest, date latest. So if I go, and the name of the group, there's a name there, the group is general, and the labels on that group name are Genica and general. So again, if I switch this into Greek, what you're going to see there at the top for general is going to be Genica. It's going to show you the Greek. And now here are the fields that are defined in that particular group. You have the trench name, okay, the type, the identifier, the title, and then the start and the end date. Now here's where the field section becomes kind of important, because what will happen here is you can see for the fields, the only thing I defined was the source there at the top. The field, first field, which said trench in iDig, is defined as source here. So the way iDig works is I've defined these fields inside this context type, but this general field section will allow me to define things about this field that I want to be applied everywhere. And in this case, if I go to the field source, I can see that the labels were made for it so that in English, I want it to say trench, and in Greek, I want it to say tomeas. Okay, so the field section, the big field section, this is just defining default values for those field names. And then I can go into the type section and define these fields in more detail. So another good example we can look at here is if we go to, let's say, the category field here. So here's a group that's defining these custom fields: contributor, buckets, category. Well, the category field here has a value list defined for it with a list of items that I want to show up as default values for the category field, right? Inside the context type, okay? Versus if I go down and say, look at the artifact type, and I go down and I find the category field there, you can see it's the same field name, category, but it has a different value list. So these are the values that you want to be default when you're dealing with an artifact versus a category. So if I go back to iDig, go into the basket, go down to the fields here, I see there's a category field here. If I go into the value list, it's going to let me select one of these values for that I've defined. If I go into a find and I go down to the category field in the find, it's going to pick up the value list that's defined in the find section, even though the field is exactly the same name. And then what you can do is, instead of having to go through and repeat for each one of these things, so if I'm in the find section, instead of having to repeat here, I want certain labels on that category field, I can just include that in the general field section up above, find the category field, and you can see there that I've defined the labels for the different languages there just once. So the general field section just lets you set defaults for the fields that are used no matter where that field shows up in the various types.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
So is it required that you fill every information you see on the not menu, on the left side, everything? Because I see that it has, other than type and basket, it has a lot of like identifier, a lot of information. Do you have to fill all these?
I'm not sure I understand where you're talking about.
Yes, not there, on iDig.
In iDig. If you're in iDig and there's all these fields,
Yes,
yeah, that's up to the excavation and what the supervisors do. Some excavation will be like, you must have something in every single field. Other excavation will be like, just fill them out where you can. So that depends on the excavation's rules.
There are no, okay, because...
iDig's not going to be a parent and make you do those things, yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, that was one of the kind of core, say, values we had when we were making, is to not be parental, to not force a person to do something, because you might be in the field in a situation where iDig's being parental and it shouldn't be, and then there's nothing you can do. So it's better to just let it be, let it be open, and you can kind of do what you want. And then, you know, if there's things that have to happen in terms of the fields and validations and things like that, that can be handled afterwards, after you get it out. There are some, I think we do have a regular expression field validation built in, but I don't think it's used very much. I don't know if it's active or not. But that's one thing people do complain about. They would like to have more, they'd like to have specific situations where iDig will force you to do one thing. And then what they'll do is you'll go, okay, I'll give you that, and then they'll be in the field in a situation where you're like, oh shoot, now I'm trapped because iDig's forced me to do this, but I'm in a situation where I don't want to do that. And they get stuck, and then they come back and yell at you because you've forced them to do that. And then you say, okay, well.
So apart from iDig, there's which is, you know, storing and recording the excavation process. The database for the findings here, has anything to do with iDig?
Well, what will happen is the internal database they use in the Agora is a FileMaker implementation. Where they have a FileMaker server with all their master data in it. At the end of the season, once the supervisors are done doing all their work on their iPads, they'll say, okay, I'm finished. They'll give it to George or me, and we basically import the data from iDig into the main database.
Okay.
So all that field, all the objects that exist in the database, the new ones at least, are imported in from iDig as they're made.
And this could work on different types of databases?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, when iDig is exporting this data, it's exporting just these very simple tables, these kind of Excel tables with the field names, and each item is one row. And these can just be imported into any database, or they can be worked at with Excel or brought into GIS programs, anything you want. So it's a very simple, low-level export format.
Can you export in CSV?
It does it in CSV, yeah. And it does a couple different formats. There's a tab-based format, there's a CSV-based format, there's a Unix-based format, because it depends on what the person wants to do with it. So they'd come and they'd ask, they say, can you have it make me an export in this format so that I don't have to take the CVS and like run it through this? And I'd be like, okay, fine.
Yeah.
So there's about 3 or 4 different formats it'll export, and they're just text files, so they're very small. So you can go through the exported trench folder, and you can look at all these different formats here. There's this is I think the Unix one on the basket, where it's doing it based on, it's doing it based on each line is basically one field, or you have the field and then the value. There's the CSV format, which numbers can load, and then there's a tab-based format as well.
Yeah, because many times in a lot of databases, they do everything, for example, in Knossos, they do everything manually. And I was wondering whether if this would be implemented in some sort of a database kind of recording,
Yeah.
if it could be, you know, a more immediate way, not type every single one. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've gone the other way too. Like when we did this project to go outside in the Agora and identify all these non-movable objects, these blocks that happen to be out on the site. I think when we started this, what we did is we exported all of these find numbers from the database, and then we imported them into iDig, so we had all the find records, and then they could just go out in the field and take the pictures of them.
That's great. Okay.
So you can do things like that too. You can go back and forth. If you take a CSV file, you can go round trip. So if I take a iDig a trench and I export this trench, I can then go through and I can edit that CSV file that it makes. I can put that CSV file back into iDig. So here, if I go back to, let's go to the numbers. If I go back to here on my iPad, iDig, Agora exported. So if I take this CSV file that iDig has generated, I can edit this, take the CSV file, put it back into the iDig folder, and when iDig starts up, it'll be like, there's a CSV file here, do you want me to import it? And it will import that as a trench. So you can do that round trip, export data, edit it, do like batch, find and replace, import it back in. So that round trip works too. So let's go back to our preferences here, and let's continue on with the context type and look at some of these. Okay, so the first group we looked at was the general group with these fields that are kind of always the same at the top. I mean, the finds don't have a date latest, they just have a date earliest field. So if I go into a find in iDig and look at the field, it's only going to have the start date here because it's assuming you found that at one point in time. So that's a difference with the finds. The next group that comes up is, this group is called attachments, and it's related images. Now, there's certain fields in here that iDig's going to recognize and do special things with. This relation attachments field, this is one of them. This field by itself, when iDig sees that field, it's going to create for you this particular related image group here, which shows you the little icon, which you can go back and forth and swipe between these pictures. You can click on the pictures, edit them. So some fields in the configuration are kind of magical fields that will create something like this whole group here, the related images. And same with the relationships. If I look at the relationship section in the preference file, if I go down, there's the relationship section, and the field relation, that's going to trigger that whole relationship section in iDig that will let you add relationships, edit them, and so on and so forth. So if we go back to this whole thing, so we had the general group, we had the relationship group, there's a relation URLs group. This only will show up if I go into iDig, for example, and if I go back to, let's say 2013, if I go inside a basket or something like that, you're not going to see that group here because there's no data that has it. But if I do something like select archived items, grab one of these archived items, now I've got this URL section. And there again is another kind of magic section where it'll take that item you're looking at and it'll show you all the different URLs that will take you to where that thing was excavated before. So if I tap on one of these, it's going to open it up essentially in the Notebook app to where that particular page was. So the relations URL group is kind of an Agarose specific group that's going to just create that little section with the links to the previous notebooks. There's a coverage spatial field. This is the points section. That one coverage spatial field is going to generate this whole point section here, which allows me to add polygons, add points, edit them, and do all that. There's the next one is going to be the contents field, okay? And this field's kind of interesting because the contents field, well, let's look at some of these others. So there's the context field, contents, there's a description section here. That's a group description, and then there's a group contents. Those two are kind of by themselves. And if I look at the description field, defined up top in the field section, you're going to see that it's marked as multi-line true. And so that is going to tell iDig for both the description field and the contents field. There's the group, there's the description group, there's the contents group. Each one of these as multi-line fields end up going from margin to margin, the whole width is available for typing versus, say, a field section where you have the field label and then a single field next to it. So by tagging one of these fields as multi-line and having it in a section by itself, you're going to get this kind of full text blob that makes it easier for people to type in. And then there's the series of specific fields. So there's description, there's contents. Now there's a group here which is just called fields, and it has contributor, buckets, the category field, notebook page, deposit, and below others. There's the chronology field, and here again the coverage temporal, coverage earliest, coverage latest. These three fields end up in iDig in the chronology section, and this will allow you to assign a certain chronology to this item, and then when you show the items, you color them by the chronology, it'll color them appropriately based on whatever that chronology happens to be. So if I color these by the face, say, now all my items are basically colored by whatever is in this chronology field on each one of the items.
And this is adaptable to the colors, right?
The colors are not now, no. They should be.
Okay.
Eventually, we'll probably abstract that part out too, but for now they're just built in, the colors.
Can I ask something?
Yes?
While working on the JSON now, or with the coding, if we make a mistake,
Yes. If you
is
make a
there
mistake like that,
yeah, and
then
don't
Jason,
know
then
afterwards,
if
yeah.
you switch, what'll happen is Jason, the parser here will say there's a parse error. It'll try to tell you what's wrong, but it doesn't always know because it's trying to figure it out for itself where the error is.
Okay.
So the best you'll get is you'll get a parse error as you're working. So it's useful to go back and forth a lot to make sure you don't make mistakes. There's some JSON parsers online that are better than others that you can use. There's web pages you can go to and paste in some JSON and it will parse it for you and tell you what's wrong with it. There's applications you can download for your computer that'll let you edit it. There's a bunch. This is one that I just use because it's on the iPad and it's handy. But there's a lot of different ones you can use that'll make
So
sure that
we're
it's
not-
formatted correctly. Exactly. And it's usually easy to do. So there's the chronology section, there's the write section, this is the status, determining what status it has. And then there is the relation section. And so that covers all those fields for the context. So again, I guess what I'm going to do today, since this is our last section together. Okay, so you've all got like a kind of a deep tour of iDig and learned maybe more than you wanted to know, but this kind of configuration work is kind of like an art form because each excavation is a little bit different in what they're tracking, what they're doing, their workflows and things like that. So some people get into this process of trying to map reality to these computer types and things like that and defining all the fields. Some people don't. That's okay. What I'm really looking for are the people who are interested in kind of doing more of this. I get emails from people quite regularly which say things like, I need someone to help me set up iDig for my excavation here. Do you know anyone? And I'm trying to collect names of people who can do this and who are interested in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an optional homework assignment for the weekend. You don't have to do it. If this is enough for you, then you're like, okay, fine, I'm done. But if you want, you can take your iPad home for the weekend. Please bring them back Monday, if you can. And I'm going to send you a list. I'm going to send you an email with 5 different excavation configuration files in it. Okay? So there'll be some questions, some general questions to make sure you know what you're doing. But I'm most interested in having you read through these to see how the other excavations define their types and fields. I want you to create a list of all the types and the labels for each type from each one of these excavations. You don't have to do the fields, just the types that they're using. Read through and look for anything that you don't understand, that's strange. There's going to be keys in here inside the file that we haven't talked about. Things like, let's see if we can find some here. So these are all labels, groups, those are all okay. Like the value list is an interesting one. The value list, you can either define a specific list and say, I only want them to choose from one of these items. Or sometimes you'll see a value list defined with no items in it. I don't know if I can find one. They're probably up here in the field group. So here under context, there's a value list defined with no items in it. And what that means is I want you to build up a value list from all values that exist in this field across iDig. So that means if you have something and they start typing something, then it will turn that term into a value list and grow as they enter data. There's this multi-value and multi-type. So if it's just a value list by itself, it's going to let you select one. If you have multi-value turned on, that'll let you select multiple ones. You can select multiple things. If multi-type is turned on, it'll look across all types that use that field in order to automatically generate a value list for that type that you'll see there. So in this case, contributor, so this is labeled as diggers, multi-type and multi-value. So it'll go across any type. So if I'm in the types here and I'm in the baskets and I go to the diggers, first of all, I can check multiple people. And it's pulling all these names from everything that exists in iDig regardless of its type. Anytime it sees that contributor field, it'll make a list for me that I can then use as a value list to select.
And this value list you have not made in the JSON.
I have not made in the JSON. It's automatically getting dynamically generated as I add terms. And so there might be some other things you encounter in here. At the very top, I think, I talk about multi-value, multi-type, and multi-line. But the idea is I want you to go through these other, if you're interested in this, go through the other excavation configurations, have a look at the types that they used, give me a list of the types and the fields from each one, and then make notes about things you don't understand, things that are odd. There are some mistakes here and there. You can catch them. Not in the JSON, but kind of in how they've configured things. But I'm mostly interested in seeing how you engage with this in order to determine whether or not I can refer other people to you, and I'll say, you should pay this person to do this for you. So maybe you'll get a job out of it one day.